this is the address, go there. This is building back in the woods, wooden floors, big glass windows, very, very scenic and unusual. So eventually he came in and he was carrying one of these tote bags filled with papers and books or something like that, shorts and Crocs.
Mhm.
And so this was sort of said right away, like, listen, I play by my rules. If you successfully run your own fund as he did, you could. The question he asked was, first of all, this is like 130 people, something like that, at Bridgewater at the time. He did all the interviews personally. He took to interview and get a sense of people. And the first question he asked was, tell me about how you grew up, mom and dad, what you talk about around the dinner table, etc. And I remember when we had a connection. I said, I have an older brother who's got a temper. And when we would get stuck in traffic, he would, pound the steering wheel and use expletives. I said, I was more of a dreamy kid. And Ray kind of leans over like this. And I go, I was less upset about the traffic than wondering about what created traffic in the first place, which is true. And
Uh-huh.
Ray leaned right in. And he was like, okay, go on.
Welcome to Talking Billions. We talk about big ideas, big inspirations, big topics. We take on the hardest topic of all, money. How to make it, save it, keep it. But our conversations lead us to an even bigger question, what it means to live a rich life beyond money. My guests share their practices, principles, and evergreen wisdom. I'm your host, Bogumil, author, TEDx speaker, and investment advisor to wealth creators with patient capital and an infinite investment horizon. I work with families and individuals who aspire to grow wealth over a lifetime and generations through disciplined, thoughtful investments in durable quality businesses while giving money meaning. Join me on this quest to unearth and share the wisdom of the ages. Let me share with you the podcast program disclosure statement. Blue Infinitas Capital LLC is a registered investment advisor, and the opinions expressed by the firm's employees and podcast guests on this show are their own and do not reflect the opinions of Blue Infinitas Capital. All the statements and opinions expressed are based upon information considered reliable, although it should not be relied upon as such. Any statements or opinions are subject to change without notice. The information presented is for educational purposes only and does not intend to make an offer or solicitation for the sale or purchase of any specific securities, investments, or investment strategies. Investments involve risk and, unless otherwise stated, are not guaranteed. The information expressed does not take into account your specific situation or objectives and is not intended as recommendations appropriate for any individual. Listeners are encouraged to seek advice from a qualified tax, legal, or investment advisor to determine whether any information presented may be suitable for their specific situation. Past performance is not indicative of future performance. None of what you're about to hear is investment advice. My guest today is Paul Podolsky. He's an author, podcaster, journalist, investor who spent time in Russia in the 1990s and then worked on Wall Street for over 2 decades, much of it at Bridgewater Associates, the world's largest hedge fund, with Ray Dalio as his boss. His father worked on the Manhattan Project with Robert Oppenheimer as his boss. Today we talk about his newest book, an absolute delight to read, The Uncomfortable Truth About Money, How to Live with Uncertainty and Learn to Think for Yourself. Paul, how are you? So nice to see you.
I'm really well. Thanks for having me.
Well, I absolutely loved your book. I was introduced to your writing by a good friend, Brendan Snow, who made this connection happen. So, Brendan, thank you. And I told you that I have 1,000 questions. So let's get started. And you'll figure out soon why I loved your book for many reasons, but one of them became obvious and I shared it with you briefly, but the audience will see in a minute. Paul, I want to jump right in, and I ask my guests about the early days, about childhood, upbringing, and how you think that time shaped you, your relationship with money, and the career path or paths that you chose.
So I was just trying to figure out how things worked. And the earliest experience I had, which I wrote about in that book, was watching something unexpected happen, but very painful, which was my mother dying of cancer when I was very young. So I think you were sharing a little bit your background growing up in Poland. Sometimes things that are very disruptive are very painful, but they also really widen your aperture for trying to understand how things work. So from a young age, I was just searching for frameworks or perspectives that would help organize reality. And I tried a bunch of them to make sense of things. And I think they all have uh, merit, really learning those different perspectives, psychological perspective, there's a historical perspective, there's an artistic perspective. But the one that really resonated with me for trying to make sense of a broad swath of reality was prices and markets and economics. And right when I finished college in 1991, I wasn't so much interested in making money. I was interested in interesting experiences. And I got a chance to work in Russia, which at the time was sort of like if North Korea was 300 million people and the biggest country in the world. That's sort of what the impression was it was. And I went there trying to understand what happened and get into it more, but I became convinced that there wasn't some grand theory why things collapsed. They had the wrong prices on everything.
Mhm.
And if you had the wrong prices on everything, you would get chaos. And so economics and money obviously doesn't explain the extraordinary bad luck of my mother, but it does explain a lot. And that's why I found that perspective so powerful.
It's connected, price and incentives, but the incentives were not aligned in that system. I
Yeah.
mentioned to you, I remember the last decade of Cold War Poland as a kid. So different memories than an adult, but you bring up a couple of stories. You bring up those empty stores. I'm curious to hear about that. You bring up a car you were driving, which was a blue Lada. I actually
Yeah.
sat in one of those when I was a kid, so I know the car. You even described the sound that the door made when you wanted to close the door. And this was the last minutes before the Soviet Union officially collapsed. You were sending telegrams back home that you're okay.
Yeah.
Can you take us back to that memory? And
Sure.
the best part is that you just graduated from Brown. You couldn't find a job in the US, you write in the book.
Right.
And you had
Right.
it you had it to the Soviet Union for an opportunity.
So the first time I was there was the summer of 1990. It was the summer between junior and senior year of college. I did like a 6 week language program there. And it's there's certain challenges with my 50s now with growing older, but there's certain beautiful things, which is perspective. So now it's a lot of us trying to figure out literally how these devices change our perspective on everything. But I vividly remember growing up in the era before any of that happened. And so the building, you can just see the bare bones of it in downtown Moscow on Tverskaya Boulevard. It was the central telegraph office. So when I arrived there that summer, there was no easy way of telling my father that I'd made it safely. And so you went to this big building, no air conditioning, lined up and filled out a telegram where you paid by the letter.
Mm-hmm.
And I wrote, arrived safely, something like all is well. And the woman literally wrote out, da, 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 told me how many kopecks, gave it to her, and then she sent that telegram to my father. That was the only communication he had from me that summer that I
Wow.
was alive. And once you were there, it was sort of like you dropped off the face of the earth.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a whole. And so then after college, 1991, the U.S. was coming out of a recession. Job market was very thin, and I was looking for some sort of experiences with widen my perspective. Like college was great, but I felt like, and now really feel like, with the benefit of age, so limited in terms of really seeing how things work. And my dad, as he mentioned, who's an older father, so he'd fought in World War II, and I remember his whole, they didn't talk about it, but you could tell a certain worldliness. I
Mm-hmm.
actually had an uncle who was a physician who was in Poland right after the war. He was describing to me what he was saying. I remember So I wanted some sort of experience that would help mature me and give me a little bit more worldly experience. And so I was offered the chance to go to Russia, and I expected to just go there for 6 months, but stayed for 3 years. And I think I learned more in Russia than I learned in college. It
Hmm.
was awfully painful, some of it, but it took a long, long time for me to begin to grasp the way Russians looked at the world as opposed to the way I looked at the world. And honestly, a year of living there wasn't enough. It took 2 years and then 3 years. And now, I've been interacting with this place for decades. It's sort of sunk in. But in some of my writing, I've described, there's Soviet software, both in China and Russia. And then there's Byzantine hardware in Russia and Confucian hardware in China. But really try to understand how the Soviet software worked, how it made people think, how society was organized. For me, it was a slow process.
And the country went through a massive change. And so did you. You ended up in New
Yeah.
York. And there's this part of the book when you say how moving to New York City, you felt more broke than ever. You, your words, not mine. But it made me pause and stop. I lived in New York for most of my adult life, as you might know. I mentioned to you, and I know people who come to New York and realize it's an expensive city, and it puts you in the right place for a minute. You also admit that you were not too financially literate at the time, so you were discovering how money works, and there was a certain scene with some rats in front of your home. And there's a quote that really made me pause and gave me chills. You said you wanted to put money and the distance between you and the wolves. The money would put that distance between you and the wolves. Tell me more about that experience, leaving Russia, coming to New York, money,
Yep.
wolves, and the
So,
distance.
so I met my wife in Russia, who I'm still coming up on our 31st anniversary. At the time when I married her, people were like, we eloped. They were like, what? He went over to Russia. Now he's married in Russia. It's going to end in disaster. Well, it's lasted. And we had our son there too. So I came back after 3 years there. I came back with a wife, with a son. I was 25 when I got married, 26 when I became a dad. I went to graduate school in economics and moved to New York for work. And it was really lean. So it was three of us in a one-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn. Our son got the bedroom, and we slept on like a futon in the kitchen. And it was, I'd not grown up wealthy. My dad worked for the government. We lived in Washington, D.C., but we were like solidly middle class. He had like a stable government salary. And when I was living in Brooklyn, we were really, I forget what the poverty level was there, but we were close to it. I'd have to go back and look. I think we were at, I Googled it. I think we were at it. And there was a massive rat nest in front of our apartment. And I remember walking there with my son, and these other guys were standing in front of looking at the rats go back and forth. And I didn't put this in the book, but one of the guys said to the other guy, and we were standing right behind him. He was like, "Those rats." Am I allowed to swear on your podcast? Is this all allowed?
Sure, if you have to, yeah.
Well, this is an actual quote. He goes, "Those rats got no fucking respect. They ought to be scared of somebody like me." And they're not. And they were just going back and forth. And I was just thinking, like, this is not the environment I want to raise my children in.
Hmm.
And there's just one thing and one thing only that is limiting me from moving to a nicer apartment building, and it's money. And
Hmm.
even though I'd watched the Soviet Union collapse, I had a graduate degree in economics, and I was at the time working as a financial journalist, I really still didn't understand the basic things about money, which is embarrassing to say, but it's true. I didn't understand how salaries were determined. I didn't understand how I could change my income. I didn't have the foggiest notion about savings or portfolios or anything like that. And then I spoke about in the book that one of my sources offered me a job as an analyst, which I realized wasn't that different than being a reporter. And in that job, I got my salary raised, and then I distinctly remember that I started work there, and I think officially in September, and in November, December, They were supposed to give me a bonus. The boss gave me a $20,000 bonus, and I was staggered, absolutely shocked. I'd never gotten such a sum of money at a point in time. And that's when I went back, and I just felt it wasn't like I was going to go out and buy some fancy sports car. I just felt safer. Like my family was in an apartment at that point where there were no rats. We had a washing machine and dryer inside of our apartment, which was a huge step up that you didn't have to walk out and do the laundry. And then all of a sudden, we had a little bit of cushion in the bank account. Like if I got fired, financial work is unstable, we would not be out on the street. And that's when I said that I realized that money put distance between you and the wolves. So the wolves were all sorts of experience that many, many people struggle with all over the world. And I'm very sympathetic for it, but it is the terrible car. It's the co-payment on the doctor's thing that you didn't expect that shocks you. It is, the relative that it's a long list of things, but the wolves are in many different forms. They're kind of preying around us all the time. And I found that if I got shrewder with money, it just gave me more security in that sense. And it really, I thought about people who pursued money in college. Like I knew these people who were it's like, what are you interviewing for? They were like, I'm doing management consulting or investment banking. I didn't even know what management consulting or investment banking was, but I knew they paid more money than what I was going to do. But I didn't understand the like solely being motivated for money. But then with a young family, when I experienced that, I understood, wait a minute, this is safety. And safety is something I really want to provide for those around me. And I think probably many people do.
Well, I completely agree. I manage money for families, multi-generational wealth, and I've been doing it for 20 years. And I can tell just having a certain amount of money sitting there, even if you don't need it or use it, just because it's present in your life makes a huge difference in
Huge.
people's life. And we can talk about the amounts and specifically, but just its presence there can help quite a bit. And you reveal quite a few truths about money throughout the book. And yet again, there's a quote that I really like when you explain how money works. When you do something others need, you get paid. When you spend less than you earn, your wealth increases. Very simple truths, but to the point. You say it's that simple. Could you share more? You've been slowly developing, as I'm reading your book, those frameworks that just made sense to you, how you can operate and navigate in this new world that you're discovering.
Yeah, I was really interested in this young years as understanding how the world worked, and I also wanted to write. I talked about that thing that I wanted to have like a Hemingway-esque experience type of thing. He was ambulance driver in World War One, and this, Russia would be this sort of thing. But then I realized that you could be working awfully hard and not get paid anything, or not
Yes.
get paid very much.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was like, probably other people that can figure this out faster, but I needed to think. I was like,
Mm-hmm.
now why are some people getting paid more than others?
Mm-hmm.
And then I just realized that it wasn't so much about me, it was about them. Like, what did they need? And what services could you provide that would meet their needs? And that's why you could sometimes have somebody who has something that, maybe you could say, oh, if I got an article published in the New Yorker or something like that, it was very prestigious. But you didn't make any money. And somebody who might own a chain of fast food restaurants that is not, as culturally influential is much more financially comfortable. And so I was like, oh, okay. And I remember I'd read the Wall Street Journal and they would have things about the salaries that people earned. And I began to think of it in these terms. And I was like, oh, this is very simple. Like it's just supply and demand. And if you have something there that is rare that somebody wants, you're going to get paid more money. End of story. So
Mm-hmm.
then I was like, okay, forget about being so focused on what I would like to do. What skills do I have that other people need me to do? And then I began thinking, and the minute I began to flex in that direction, then the money situation got a little bit easier and it required deforming yourself a little bit to the system. And then in terms of spending, I remember really that sense of being tight, and it's a physical feeling. And I just began to write down on a spreadsheet, like for me, translating that tight emotional feeling to something that I could just observe and see. I didn't need some sort of financial software. I was like, just on Excel, this is what's coming in, this is what's going out, here's where the problem is. And
Yeah.
I just tried to shrink what was going out as much as I could, but there were limits to what you could do
Mm-hmm.
on that. And then it was like, okay, if that's not going to work, then it's going to need to come from the other side of the ledger. what do I need to do to make that other side of the ledger work? And just being very practical about that, about it was like a very mechanical problem. And that helped a lot. And I think that some people find that very unromantic, like getting things down just down to a spreadsheet and thinking like I could do this or I could, but that's what solved that problem for me. Solve is a strong word. That's what helped soften the acuity of those uncomfortable sensations.
We go through schools, we get to all the degrees, and we end up somewhere, we find a job, and we never really have the time to think about, will I get paid for what I do
Yes,
in a proportionate way? That's one
almost
question,
uncouth to mention it,
right?
right?
It's
Like in college. And it's like, why not? I'm sorry for interrupting.
no, it's, and then the second thought is, well, I am making this much money, but I can't afford to live in the city, for example, right? And then you start to ask questions, well, what would I need to do to be able to afford to live comfortably in this particular city? And then the conversation changes, but it's surprising how late those conversations happen in so many lives. I know,
Yes.
I'm in my mid 40s now, but I know people in their 20s and they're finishing schools and they have great degrees and they will get great jobs, but they haven't really thought about the questions you bring up in your book. How do those equations work? Okay, so I
Yes.
got a good degree, I'm getting this job, but how does this whole thing work that you have something left at the end of the month so you can stay away from those wolves that you talk about?
Yeah, it's such a prosaic thing. And I feel like, at least for me, it wasn't taught in school. And it's like a basic, like I wrote this thing in part for my kids, but in part for anybody who's in that situation. I was like, it's complicated, but it's not that complicated. And when
Yeah.
I read other money books, to me, it just didn't boil it down to a very practitioner's type of experience.
Hmm.
And everybody I know who's decent with money runs spreadsheets like that.
They
Like
do.
if they're early in the thing and late, it's like they want to know what's coming in, they want to know what's going out, how that
Hmm.
looks, and they think about it like a living organism.
Hmm.
And that's just one more thing. I make these comparisons to nutrition. It's like people who check what their VO2 max is or their weight.
Hmm.
Those are not perfect metrics, but there's some metrics of whether things are going okay or not.
So speaking of wolves, and you mentioned getting fired, you actually got fired. And you went,
Voice.
at one point, you write in your book, you went from a guy with a mortgage to a millionaire in a day.
Yeah.
What happened?
Yeah. So, and then I was fired shortly after that. So what happened was, one of the things that I didn't feel was that is worth sort of pausing and think about is that
Hmm.
we all crave something from money, a degree of stability that money never, ever, ever will give you. It
Hmm.
just won't because the substance itself was unstable. If you obviously for an investment perspective, I'm looking at a Bloomberg screen behind the screen with you, and you can see these prices flitting all over the place. That's literally the instability of money manifests. But so I joined a bank. I was paid in stock options, in part in stock options. I didn't even know what a stock option was. I knew what an option was. I knew what a stock was, but I didn't really think about the implications of that.
Hmm.
And I was given a grant each year, and then each year the stock price of the bank would fall further. And
Right.
so after 6 years, I had a whole drawer full of here's this year's grant, here's this year's grant, all worthless. And because the bank wasn't doing well, it was a takeover target. And then I woke up one fine morning and Bank of America had bought our bank. And then they announced what the price would be. And then I was like, I think that's way above the price of those stock options. And so I literally went to a file cabinet, I pulled them out, and I looked, and it was at a massive premium for all these stock options. And I was like, oh my goodness. So 6 years or 5 years or however many of these options that were worthless, all of a sudden they went quote unquote in the money. And I looked to see what the date was we could exercise those stock options. And it was like 6 weeks after the merger. So I looked at that into my calendar. And then I understood how flows could change this because everybody around me had the same type of deal. And if you looked at the stock price on the screen, the day those stock options became exercisable, the
Yeah.
stock began to go because everybody who was in that situation was like, get out and liquidate. And that's how I went from being, first staring at the rats to working as a bank.
Hmm.
And yeah, I became a millionaire after that,
Incredible.
with exercising those things. And so I momentarily felt flush.
Hmm.
And then there was, of course, a whole integration thing.
Hmm.
And then I got fired. And then I asked the guy who was a friend of mine who was firing me, he said, Bank of America will no longer need your services. And I kind of expected it to happen, but it was still a terrible feeling. I had at that point two small kids, and the expenses, et cetera. And I said, what about you? And he goes, Bank of America will no longer be needing my services either. So his job was to pull us into an office, fire everybody, and then fire himself. And this is what corporate America is like.
Yes.
And that's another thing that people are, it's so topsy-turvy.
Mm-hmm.
And I talked about in the book that made an impression on me that the bank had very, very fancy, I think, granite or some sort of stone headquarters. And I remember it was chiseled in there, the name of the bank and everything. And it was as if it was going to be there permanent. And I remember being chiseled off of the facade. And I was like, nothing here is permanent. This is the nature of the world we live in. And so somehow I have to make friends with this constant uncertainty. And I think we all do, because we have one life to live. We want to live that well. Money's not everything, but it's a part of it. But we have to somehow get into a comfortable relationship with that instability.
I have so many thoughts, and I want to ask you about meeting Ray Dalio in a second. But as I'm listening to you, there are some banks that are the same name today, but we know that the equity investors got wiped out many times over. There are some European banks that have been around for 250 years, but it's not the same shareholders. Every time around, it's new people joining the party for whatever reason until the next wipeout. So that's something to think about. So even if the name is chiseled, doesn't mean it's the same owners.
Good point.
And you brought up corporate America, and you write about it and uncertainty and volatility, and we'll come back to those. But I want to bring up your dad and his story. He chose a certain career that provided stability. Can you talk about it? Because it's very different than the experience you've had, and maybe you've been searching that kind of stability, but you were not finding it in those places.
Yeah, so my dad was a child of the Great Depression. So he was born in the 1920s. He lived through, he's obviously passed now, but he lived through 1929 to 1933. It was a very vivid experience to him. And then also he was a young man in World War II. So he experienced extreme volatility in his life. And to put this into terms people are less familiar with it, stock prices in the Great Depression didn't just decline, they fell 90%, 90. And they took decades to recover. That's what real economic turmoil is. The unemployment rate it wasn't like it went from 4% to 5%. It went to 25%. And it's all because of terrible monetary policy, which is a separate story. So he'd experienced this extreme volatility and he didn't like it. And also his father was uneducated. And I think my dad he was very passionate about being a scientist, but he also craved the stability. So he was there at the founding after he completed his military service, he got his PhD, and then he was there at the founding of the NIH, the National Institutes of Health. And so he got a job there in a lab. He was a biophysicist, so he was trying to solve muscular dystrophy, which is obviously a very noble thing, but his salary would fluctuate by maybe like $10,000. In other words, if he went to G7 to G8, that's what would happen to his salary. And it was a guaranteed pension, but the job was 100% stable. It was almost impossible to get fired from the NIH. And that I think that it made that was his solution to the money problem. It is a solution for sure. But even now with the political changes in the US, maybe even the federal government won't be a safe place to work. But that's what he did. And it allowed him to, in a way, be money ignorant. For instance, he never invested his savings until very, very late in his life. And that's also a potential solution. It wasn't the one that I chose.
Taking that kind of risk out of the equation, that was the choice that he made. And many people have, and many people try to do it these days. I think it's harder and harder to do that. There are, as you mentioned, fewer and fewer places where you can find that kind of stability. I want to bring up a story that you share in the book, actually two stories. One, you're meeting Ray Dalio for the first time, and you mentioned how he was underdressed for the occasion. You can fill in the gaps. And then you were sitting with him in a private plane, and you had some revelations about the experience taking off. I think it was in Asia, and you were looking down and thinking of what you've seen, and you share your experience, what was going on in your mind at the time. Can you talk about those two experiences?
Sure. So it's a lot of people, it's a long experience. A lot of people are fascinated with Ray and want to know Ray's stories. So I think, Ray taught me a lot. I'm very grateful for my relationship with him. I think that sometimes the portrayals of him are kind of cartoonish. He's a complex person. He's a very hardworking person, extremely hardworking person. Um, so I met him. When I was working at the bank, I knew I wanted to be an investor, not on the sell side. And I knew I really wanted to do macro investing. And I was either going to create my own fund, which I did much later. So I really wanted to be a macro investor, and I was either going to start my own fund, which is what I do now, or I was going to work at the elbow of somebody who had done this. So I was interviewing, networking, and I actually interviewed for a job at Citigroup. And somebody said, "You're a terrible fit for Citigroup, but there's this headhunter that's been pestering me for this other guy, and I think he'd be a good fit there." So I was like, okay. So the headhunter was Ray's headhunter. And Ray at this point was not an icon. This was 2004. He was known as a guy who did really good research and really wasn't even known that much as a money manager, candidly. So that she said, he's in Westport, Connecticut. This is the address. Go there. So I went there in the summer of 2004, and this building back in the woods. Wooden floors, big glass windows, very very scenic and unusual. And I get brought down to this room for the interview. And so first of all, I'm waiting there, and it's like the meeting was whatever 2 o'clock or something like that. Like 2 goes by, 2:15 goes by, 2:20 goes by, like 2:30. I'm like, is this meeting not happening? So I walk out of the hallway. It's a thin staff. There wasn't anybody there like waiting around, like all sorts of stuff. I was like, I didn't even think I had a book with me or something like that. So I just went back there and sat. So eventually he came in, and he was carrying a canvas bag, like one of these tote bags, filled with papers and books or something like that, shorts and Crocs. And at the bank I'd come from, they were very uptight about the uniform you were supposed to wear. And so this was sort of said right away, like, listen, I play by my rules. And if you successfully run your own fund as he did, you could.
Yeah.
And then we had an interview process that was like any other interview I'd had. So as opposed to saying, tell me about your last position, or how would you price this thing to that, or if how would you estimate how many square feet a building, like any of those types of questions, there's nothing like that. The question he asked was, first of all, this is like 130 people, something like that, at Bridgewater at the time. He did all the interviews personally. The first interview,
Right.
there were people behind him, but he was the first interview, which is unbelievable about how long, how much time he took to interview and get a sense of people. And the first question he asked was, tell me about how you grew up, mom and dad, what you talk about around the dinner table, etc. And I remember when we had a connection, I said, I have an older brother who's got a temper. And when we would get stuck in traffic, he would, pound the steering wheel and use expletives. I said, I was more of a dreamy kid. And Ray kind of leans over like this. And I go, I was less upset about the traffic than wondering about what created traffic in the first place, which is true. And Ray leaned right in, and he was like, okay, go on. And that was like a connection, because that was sort of, he was interested in how that connection
Mm-hmm.
And we spoke, even though he showed up 30 minutes late, I think the interview was 90 minutes. It's a long time to speak with a potential candidate. And then only
Sure.
after that did the other interviews go. So that was the first thing. So I worked with Ray closely for, years. And then you're right that at the end of towards the end of my time at Bridgewater, he and I were flying. And um, I thought about where he was in life.
Mm-hmm.
And he'd obviously been incredibly successful, but I also felt that degree of success, it kind of tended to isolate you from life. And I really liked being in the muck of life. I felt like I understood it better. And I just kind of looked at it then and I said, you know what? It's time for me to move on. That this way that he's going is not the way I need to go on my path. Even though I have enormous respect for what he created, like he created it all through unbelievable hard work. And I didn't want to be doing that. And that's when the light bulb sort of popped that I part of it that I needed to move on.
And the next chapter followed. You brought up something that I don't want to miss. You talked about certain understanding about that traffic example, and I'll come back
Yeah.
to the second part. And I like the word curiosity, and even about this podcast and my writing and my work, I'm curious, but what I'm really looking for is understanding. I'm trying to understand things. And even, the questions that I ask, I'm trying to understand the person behind the book. Or if I'm meeting a client, I'm trying to understand what kind of money are we talking about and what meaning it has in your life and what kind of purpose it could have going forward and so on. So when people say curiosity, I think what they really mean is understanding. And what you showed, Ray, in that conversation, you were after understanding.
Yeah. And it's one of his colleagues, Bob Prince, is still CIO there, once said, I don't know if it's true, but he once told me that if you look at a person's brain, what are some of the biggest, like if you look at a CAT scan of when there's total joy and the brain is firing, it's when there's a connection, when there's understanding. And I
Mm-hmm.
still feel that way, that process of uh, continual learning and compounding, I think it's just one of the greatest joys of being alive. And it takes many different forms. Yes, it's understanding about how a stock or bond or portfolio works, but also the same thing you do, understanding how people work. And it's one of the reasons why, when I'm not investing, I find, or, talking with interesting people like you or other people in my life, I find that reading great authors is just so unbelievably fantastic. Because if you think about what a great, great writer is doing it is the only art form that is taking you inside the mind of multiple people at once and allowing you to have that experience. Of course, they're inventing it, but they're creating characters. It's allowing you to jump into it. So even right now, as we have a conversation, you don't know exactly what I'm thinking, and I don't know exactly what you're thinking, what having. And that what a great literature is doing is he's sort of freezing that, and he's imagining what that dialogue is in your head, and he's imagining what that dialogue is in my head, and trying to describe what makes a person tick. And yes, I find it utterly fascinating. And investing is just another avenue for doing that.
When I picked up the book One Up on Wall Street when I was in college, an exchange student in Brussels by Peter Lynch, I didn't think I'm going to become the richest person in the world. I was thinking this is a fascinating puzzle, a
Yeah,
riddle to
yeah,
solve.
yes,
And I don't know if I'll beat the market. I have no idea. It doesn't matter, but it's very intriguing. And that's what sucked me in, and that's what kept me going for the following 2 decades. And reading your book, I realized, and you talk about it, how it's like literature and how it never ends because you always find something new, a new
yes.
way of looking at things, a new way of understanding certain asset classes, and how it all comes together. Why those things go up when the other things go down? How it's all connected, and it's a never-ending pursuit, and I
Yeah.
find it fascinating.
And just to add on to piggyback on that thought, the thing that distinguishes, I think, markets from, say, literature is, or just, subjective experience of going someplace, is you could actually say what's true.
Mm.
In other words, we could have, do we think that stocks are going to go up next year or down next year? We could have a debate about that, and it would be a fascinating thing about trying to fill out the puzzle. But 12 months from now, we'll know. It'll be
Yes.
factually clear what exactly
Yes.
happened. And that mix of like a puzzle, but one that is ultimately provable, is
Hmm.
such a beautiful thing about markets. And I feel like, from my perspective, really good investors tend to be kind of weird. And it makes total sense for me to be weird because I'd have to look at the same set of information a little bit differently.
Hmm.
But unlike something like an art where it might be proven that somebody was weird but actually insightful way after they're dead, in investing, it can be indicative while they're alive.
At the end of the day, the time will show. And the other part that I liked about investing when I was a 20-year-old kid, and I still do, is that the market doesn't care if you're
Yes.
young, if you're old,
Yes.
what's your gender, what's your
Yeah.
background,
Yeah.
were your parents investing or not. The market doesn't care, right? And it's absolutely secondary if you go in and join with $100 and you can buy a few shares, or if you go in with 100 million, a different game. But the market it's just there, it's
Yes.
at the end of the day, I can be right with my $100 as much as somebody else can be right with $100 million. They'll
Yes.
double, I'll double, or I'll lose all of it. It could happen too. Speaking about being weird and a different perspective, I bring it up in my writing. I'm left-handed, and when I was going to school in
Me too.
Poland, you are. Oh
Yeah.
wow, makes two of us. When I was going to school, Paul, until the age of 18, I thought that there's just like one or two of us in the world. In my classroom, it was me and the worst student in the class that was left-handed. And I don't know if he was the worst because he kind of gave up. There was they didn't make us change hands, but teachers would take me around the classroom. And I write about it in my book, Money, Life, Family, how they would show me other kids writing, and they would show me how bad my writing is. As a left-handed person, it's hard. It was always hard for me to write. I didn't see what I'm writing. And I went to college. Paul, I'm showing up in my first course class lecture. People are taking notes, and I'm looking left to right. And I saw more left-handed people in those 5 minutes at that university than I had in the previous decade of my life. And then I realized there are quite a few US presidents who are left-handed. There are quite
Hmm.
a few accomplished people in different fields. There are many ways to be different. It's just one of them. But I think at that moment I felt empowered to embrace the fact that I'm different, and I will always see things from a different perspective than other people. And other people have other ways to see things differently. This is just mine. And I write and I see things differently. I sit at a desk differently, and so on. So immediately, for a long time, people would point out that I'm different, and it took a while to embrace it. But it's
Yes.
curious that you are left-handed. What was the experience like for you going to school as a left-handed person?
Oh, I was a really difficult student.
Hmm.
In addition to being left-handed, I'm also mildly dyslexic. And the way it manifested in me is that certain subjects they would be unusually easy for me, like
Mm-hmm.
geometry, because
Mm-hmm.
it's more spatial. I could be fantastic at that. And then different subject, chemistry, would crush me. And I would be like the last in the class. And so it was very unpredictable. And it just took me a while to realize I think my brain literally is wired differently, and I acquire information more slowly than many people. And it uh, gave me perspective on school. I began to see school as uh, something that really rewards people that process information quickly, as opposed to people who are independent thinkers.
True.
And so I would be frustrated a lot that I couldn't do as well in school as I felt like I was capable of doing. And then with perspective, I was like, oh, wait a minute, they're optimizing for a different thing. And so it took time to get comfortable with that, just like a little bit with you with I had terrible handwriting and all that type of stuff. And I think I'm mixed dominant. So I'm left on some side and right on the other.
Mhm.
And it basically means my wiring is a little bit scrambled. And but I came to believe that actually, like you're saying, that was a comparative advantage for the things I like to do, to write and invest. Being a little bit scrambled is good. If I wanted to be an accountant, not so good.
It's funny that you say that because I play sports with my right hand, and
Uh-huh.
I can only write and draw with my left hand. So something is scrambled in there too, and it definitely allowed both of us to see things from a different perspective. And it's something that's hard to embrace at school because you want to fit in, and I think it
Yes.
takes a bit of time and courage to realize, well, if you want to stand out, especially when you want to get that first job or the second job, it's okay to be different. And I think we need to hear it sooner.
Yes. Yeah.
And it's,
It's a very delicate balance because both things are true.
mm,
And this is something I try to talk a lot about in the book. Like, I think one of the hardest, I forget who said it, the mark of an intelligent person is somebody who can hold two different contradictory ideas. I think it was F. Scott Fitzgerald said that at the same time
right.
and both be true. And on the one hand, that thinking differently and accepting that is part of it.
Mm.
And you also need to listen to the signal and not get too in love with your own eccentricities, because the world is the world, just like the market's the market, the world is the world, and you need to live within that reality.
I have this idea of being a contrarian when it comes to investing, but it doesn't mean that I'm going to run out without an umbrella on a rainy day, right? Like
Right.
we use our judgment, and there are moments where it's worthwhile to look around and realize you look out the window and you see everybody is holding an umbrella. They made a decision, right? And
Right.
then you decide, I'll take an umbrella. I'm not going to
Right.
question that. So I think taking any idea to its limits, you have to do a little bit of, it's more nuanced than that. But in the terms of markets, the market is telling you something and it's
Yes.
worth listening.
Yeah.
And speaking of that, I want to bring up George Soros, who I've read about a lot, and I remember trying to understand how he operated. He's a different mind than most investors, and
Yeah.
I don't think I brought up his name on this podcast much, but you write about him, and what's more, you met him, and you write that he's more concise and brilliant in person than in his writing, something along those lines. Can you share what it was like to meet George Soros?
Yeah. I met him at a couple of different gatherings when I was young and very young in my career. I was in my 20s and 30s. So the bank I was at, there are these G7 IMF meetings,
Mm-hmm.
and there are these gatherings there that are only for either like the CEO of the bank or ministers of finance, or if the founders of firms. These So they sent the invitation to the CEO, he refused. Then they sent it to the vice chairman, like he refused. Then they sent it to the head of capital. It went all the way down the bank. Like nobody was interested in these things.
Mm-hmm.
And then it finally came that the trading floor came by and he was like, "You seem to be interested in this type of stuff. We have the bank has representation at the G7 IMF meetings. Nobody wants to attend. Do you want to attend?" And
Sure.
I was like, "What? Yes, yes, I'll go." So that's where I ran into him in one of the gathering here in New York at the Council of Foreign Relations. And the first his writing is abstruse, and I don't think he's a great writer, though he's a brilliant man, and we can talk about what the essence of the writing, what the essence of that I took to be his ideas that I actually think are helpful in making sense of what's going on. But I'll tell you one story that blew me away. So Vladimir Putin was appointed, uh, president of the Soviet Union, president of Russia, December 31st, 1999. And I was at a gathering with Soros 2 weeks after that. And I said, "Mr. Soros, what's your assessment of Russia's new president?" And he just looked at me very directly and he goes, "Not to be trusted." That was it. He said nothing else.
Uh-huh.
And like shortly after that, like Bush met him, and Putin totally played Bush. He knew he was a born again Christian. He had a cross in his shirt that he allowed to fall out of his shirt while he was talking with them. And he told Putin that his grandmother's dacha had burned down and the only thing left is his cross, and he always carried it. Lies. The whole thing made up. None of it true. And
Mm.
that's when Bush made that statement. I looked into his eyes, to the soul of the man. He got completely played. And that's with the entire U.S., CIA apparatus around advising him, completely played. And Soros, just looking at the situation, knowing his background, got it like that. And so that's a form of brilliance, of being able to synthesize an incredibly complicated situation. If you play back that time, there was Yeltsin, he was a drunk, was it? There are all these different theories. And
Mhm.
Soros just nailed it. And the other time, I don't remember his precise words, was during the 1998 financial crisis. I remember being in a room with him and him just describing what was going on and what was at stake and what the authorities would need to do to rectify the situation, and also just being blown away at his ability to synthesize so clearly. So clearly, not every day is like that. He spoke about how painful it was for him
Mhm.
to manage his fund and how the risk took a toll on him, and it obviously does. But his ability to, I found that with really great investors, their ability to synthesize through lots of competing information and come up just with a simple sentence about what's going on
Mhm.
is the highest form of the art form, if you will.
And also an incredible judge of character, which
Yes,
is very important in many professions, but especially in this one when
yes,
investing is basically trusting other people with your money. And
yes.
that really matters. Who is really in charge and how they operate. Incredible meetings, incredible memories that you share in the books. I wanted to bring it up. Paul,
Can I tell you one other story there from
tell
that
me.
same
Yeah.
thing that
Yeah.
what I didn't put in the book? But
Let's do it.
when I was at the G7 IMF meetings in Prague, we'd have to check the year. Maybe it was 2001 or two, I don't remember, somewhere around there. You could Google it and find out the exact date. Anyways, they were in Prague. There were all these anti-global protesters around, and I was waiting to go into the building, and it was kind of this awful building. And there was a guy standing next to me in black jeans, a black leather jacket, and black wraparound sunglasses, not very tall. And I was like, who is this poser? Like, everybody here is in some sort of business, like, what's this guy's deal? He and I are standing next to each other for 10, because we're past the security cordon. For 10 minutes, we're standing there not saying a word while we're waiting for somebody to come out from the center and bring us in. The
Mhm.
next day, I opened the newspaper. It was Bono from
Oh,
U2 standing right there, and he was on his debt relief thing. And that was my one chance to blah with Bono. And I was too dumb to recognize who he was.
incredible. Incredible. You've had so many moments throughout both your journalistic career and then your financial career, meeting people, and you bring it up in the book that you wouldn't be in the same room with had you not had the career you had. And to see them operate, I think that stays with you and makes you think how people that we see only on the covers of magazines, what are they like in person?
Yes.
And
Yes.
they're just people, but they're unique people. And they are where they are for a reason. But there's more to it. Paul, I want to ask you about change and disruption. And you write about it quite a bit in the book. The reason I want to bring it up, the kind of clients that I have and the kind of fortunes I've been managing, they've been around for multiple generations in many cases, and they've gone through a lot of change. And you talk about that evolution creates constant shifting of winners and losers, getting fired and hired, investors getting rich and wiped out. How do you navigate that better? Because we know that the future will be a lot alike. There will be shifts and changes, and we are talking about AI these days. There will be businesses that will go away. There are investment approaches that will not work, and so on and so on. How do you navigate it?
So it depends a little bit on what you mean by you. So my way of personally navigating it is probably
Mm-hmm.
different than the way the sort of royal you navigates it. I think the royal you is um, save aggressively, have a big margin of error in your investing, spread your risk among a lot of different assets, and don't put too much in any one thing. That's sort of the best you can do if it's just the average person.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of what I do, it's different, which is I think uh, top down about, first of all, what's going on globally in terms of growth and inflation and policy. And by policy, I mean fiscal and monetary policy. What's going on in the world? Then I break that down to individual countries. How does the US differ from Europe, differ from Japan, differ from China? Then I break that down into views on individual asset classes, stocks, bonds, currencies. I think of commodities as a global asset class. And then I break it down to specific parts of that market. So if we're talking bonds, we're talking corporate or government. If we're talking government, are we talking short-term bonds versus long-term bonds? If we're talking equities, are we talking an index or a subset of stocks? And then those questions begin to take on very, very granular importance within there. So, for instance, in policy in the United States, is it going to be inflationary or is it going to be deflationary? That is critically important for what you decide to do with bonds. And
Right.
then as bonds begin to change, it changes what you would do with stocks. Then within equities, if you think about the indexes or the sectors you want to hold, you think very carefully about the cash flows of that specific, if you're down to an individual equity or group of equities, what are the cash flows of those individual companies? And if I see anything there that I'm uncertain about, I don't touch it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my principle when I'm coming into investing is that the way I invest my own stuff, and this isn't investment advice, you got to do your own research, et cetera, but, is I try to understand the cash flows of that individual stock or bond or whatever. If I can understand it and see what's going to happen, I'll take risk. But if anything is ambiguous, I just don't touch it and I move away because I realize that what you're describing it can happen all the time. So if there's a specific company that is at major risk of disruption, like you could say, are legacy car makers, this is a relevant question in Europe, are legacy car makers in Europe going to be able to adapt to electric cars? My answer to that is I got no clue.
Mm-hmm.
But it's certainly possible that they could get crushed. So
Sure.
by no means am I going to hold that stock in my
Mm-hmm.
portfolio, just avoid it. And so in avoiding really disastrous money things is a big part of the battle. People are always bragging about, oh, I bought this stock and it went up 50% and stuff like that. Well, you telling me about the stocks that went down 70% that you own? And those are the stocks that are getting destroyed by that, or the bond that is getting destroyed by it.
Mm-hmm.
Another story I talk about in the book is previous to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, I used to hold some Russian assets in my portfolio, and there were bonds there that were paying much higher yields than U.S. bonds. There were banks there that were trading at a fraction the price of U.S. banks that had just good cash flows. But then when I began to look at what Putin was doing, I said, geez, I don't think he's stupid enough to invade Ukraine. But if he does, this is going to be one of those change situations that I'm going to be wiped out. So even though I think there's 10% odds of this happening, if it happens, it's catastrophic. I sold everything. And so that's how I deal with that type of stuff. In
Well,
that case, overreacting turned out to save my butt.
it rhymes with the way I think. When I tell clients, when you look at the portfolio and the holdings, it's not just what we hold, but also so many things that I chose to say no to.
Yes.
And the reasons, there are many reasons, but you pointed out some of them. You don't have to own everything. Like, it's a choice. And there are
Yes.
areas and times when I just can't get comfortable with something for whatever
Yes.
reason. And it's absolutely okay not to have it. That's how I feel about it. And
Or
it's,
significantly reduce the risk of it.
there you go. Yeah. Make it smaller. I want to bring up volatility. You say that it's inescapable, but you also say that the first step to being good with money is learning how to be as calm as possible so that you have the best odds of thinking clearly when the earlier mentioned disruptive shifts occur. And I'm thinking the most recent, March 2020, the market collapsing and the pandemic coming. We didn't know how long, how bad, and then everything else. But staying calm in those moments, it's very important. And you bring it up a couple of times throughout the book. You found a way to do it. What's your framework? How do you stay calm in those times?
Well, I think the first thing to do um, is to recognize that it's as much a part of the equation as anything else. Like well, if I just started off investing, I was like, oh, I need to, research all these things and know all these models, blah, 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 for pricing assets. No, I think a big part of it, first of all, is just being very chilled out.
Mm.
And I wouldn't say I've accomplished it. I would say I work at it.
Mm.
And the ingredients to make somebody calm are not a secret. It's just a question of doing them. So sleep
Mm.
a lot. A lot of things that you might think, like when I was in college, Clinton was president. It was considered very cool if you got 4 hours of sleep a night. You were, constantly doing. I think all of that's terrible advice for investing. Sleep,
Mm.
get lots of exercise, meditate, do yoga. If you have stuff you need to work out, get a therapist, spend time with your friends. All of that stuff that there's no secret at all about it. It works. So do it and realize that that is part of bringing a fresh mind to investing. And so I gradually learned all those things over time. I remember discovering long distance running and really thinking that if I went out for a run, it was like an indulgence. It's silly.
Mm.
Don't think about any of that stuff. So spend time to bring your calm self. And then, my wife is a therapist, and she says they have this phrase, you name it, you tame it. So sometimes when you're investing, you're going to feel anxious. You could feel like anxious that you bought too little of something and it's going up. Darn, I should have bought more. Or you could feel the exact anxious the other way. I bought something and now it's going down and I feel stupid. So you're going to have those feelings. And I just think that you need to befriend those feelings. Realize that that emotional sense of regret or feeling like you were silly is just going to accompany there. And then when it shows up, as opposed to like tamping it down, you go like, yep, that's that feeling when I'm losing money. It's familiar. Okay. How do I, do I need to do anything here or do I just watch? So that's big difference between being an analyst and being an allocator in some form. An analyst, you're just describing what it is. The allocator, you're dealing with the psychological intensity of experiencing those decisions, and you just try as best you can, but none of us are perfect. So that's that. And then in terms of the volatility, yeah, I think about that whole range of financial choices and life choices you make, and what is the vol of them? In other words, how big can they move? The Russia example is one. That was those assets weren't that volatile up to that moment, but once that happened, the vol would explode. And the
Mm.
risk that seemed like it was maybe only 5% of my portfolio, all of a sudden, if it was complete loss, it would become much bigger.
Mm.
So to make it, get rid of it type of thing. So thinking about all those things in your life, what's the volatility in your life of driving a car at high speed without a seatbelt? Very, very high.
Mm. You make certain choices and then you get comfortable with the risks that you can endure or not. There's a big picture quote laid in your book, and I'm coming closer to the end, so I'm putting the big ones here. You bring up that money is a cage. You need a strategy to live within its confines. And it's such a powerful statement, and I can relate to it, and I think my clients can relate to it, that no matter how much money you have, there are limits to what you can do. And there's this idea that there are risks that even the richest cannot afford, and there's a certain lifestyle that's too expensive, even for the richest people out there. Can you talk about that idea? It's a cage and a confine, not two very harsh words to describe, especially when you're sitting down with somebody that has a substantial amount.
Yeah, I think these first of all, the psychological implications of money, I don't think will go away. So even for a very, wealthy person statistically, okay, maybe they've got $1 billion. If they lose 500 million bucks, they're still going to have $500 million, which is a lot of money. But I guarantee you that person that loses 500 million bucks is going to be in excruciating. But well, not to guarantee you. Maybe there's some people who are, but the vast majority of people, even though they're going from 1 billion to 500 million, if they lose 50% of their wealth, they are going to be freaking out. Most people.
Mm.
So that's an example of the psychological power of it. And something else I didn't realize also is that um, as you become wealthier, in a way, your responsibilities shift because you've been successful, clever enough, whatever the set of conditions are, to earn this money. But there's a lot of people who haven't been.
Mm.
And so there's these obligations that some people feel. I certainly feel to others who aren't in that situation. My wife has lots of family still in Russia and Ukraine who's had been horribly disrupted
Mhm.
by what's been going on. So what's our responsibility to them? We have people in the family anyway. So that's what I'm talking about. The cage. When you don't have enough money, the cage is incredibly obvious. It's the rats in Brooklyn I talk about. But
Mhm.
even as you face these limits and these trade-offs, these obligations that make the whole relationship complicated from beginning to end.
Beautifully put. I want to ask you about your definition of success, but I have one more quote that I don't want to
Okay.
forget. Early in your book, and then you repeat a version of it down the road. I was always in search of moments that transcend the ordinary, that reminded me of what a miracle it is to be alive. Can you talk about that quote?
Sure. So I, we started the conversation on my mother's passing, and that very early on gave me a sense of how fleeting this whole thing is.
Mm.
And as much as um, I'm accomplishment focused, I wrote this book. I hope this book does well. I hope, my new venture, K Capital, does well. Like I have all those aspirations like everybody else does. But I also think it's really important to balance that with a constant stopping and just being amazed at the wonderful things all around us. So I was in New York City today. I guess you were too. It was a very, very cold day. And I thought there was something beautiful in the cold. I had a meeting in Midtown and I got a bike and I went up there and it was freezing cold day. And I just wanted to feel the cold and feel the sunshine and just be aware of that moment. And I try to do things like that uh, every day as a reminder and note how special it is. And so this is one of these delicate balances that we do need to be practical and think about our risk management, da, da, da. And then you need to sort of toggle and look at that just remarkable thing that here we are, and we
Mhm.
don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. And just the experiencing what we both experienced today is just a beautiful, beautiful thing.
I love that. Paul, one last question. What's your
Yep.
definition of success?
Um, I think success is um, finding a way to uh, perform, to do work in life that is meaningful to you and to others, and to be in a web of relationships that deepens over time. I think that that's it. Like I was thinking about this today. I was in a business meeting earlier today, and I was pretty excited. I was interested with the people who were at the meeting with. I was interested in what the topic was. And I thought, like, would I be happier if I were at a bar in Honolulu or some beach thing? What the image of
Mhm.
um, whatever that guy's name is, Jimmy Buffett, Margaritaville, something like that. Like, would I be happier with that than this? And I was like, I wouldn't. Maybe somebody would. I wouldn't. And I think it's because I find that my dad loved his science. I really like, the work that I do, and that I like the web of people that it's built over decades that I find just so fascinating to hear what they're up to, hear how they're evolving, interact with them. I think that's the essence of it for me.
I love the sound of it. The people, the relationships, and the work that means something to you. Paul, this was incredible. I'm very grateful we made it happen. I have to thank Brendan Snow again. Brendan, thank you so much for connecting us.
I think it was a little bit hard to reach. I apologize for that.
Not at all. It was. I'm very grateful for this opportunity, and I highly recommend the book, The Uncomfortable Truth About Money. It's a book that will make this audience think, and the stories are so real, and it's you, it's your family, and we can learn a lot through your experience, and I highly recommend the book. And it's a book that I wish I read along with Peter Lynch's book, One Up on Wall Street, because I looked for some of the answers longer than I'm willing to admit, but they're in your book, so I highly recommend it. Paul.
Thanks so much for having me, and thanks for taking the time.
What a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Great.
You were listening to Talking Billions. We talk about big ideas, big inspirations, big topics. We take on the hardest subject of all, money. But our conversations lead us to an even bigger question: what it means to live a rich life beyond money. If you enjoyed the show, please take a moment and follow, subscribe, rate, and share with friends and family. We rely on word of mouth to promote the show. One click for you means the world to us. Thank you. Until next time, your host, Bogumil Baranowski.